you know, Asians can't be wrong, right? And it's too much shame. Um, what do you guys think?
To reach the lost,
Yeah, to reach the lost. What else? Keep going with that.
to glorify God.
To glorify God, right? But what do you do? Reach the lost, and what are you doing? You're right, but there's
Disciples.
make disciples. Yes, that's the big one, right? It's all about making disciples. And something I realized was like, everyone says that, but what is a disciple? I think that's the question that it's like, what does that mean? I think rather than focusing on, so what is a disciple then? Because so many mission statements are make disciples, a lot of churches' focuses are on, what is that? What do you think the church's focus then is on? Jeff?
Outreach.
Outreach, yeah, but yeah, that's good, right? So like improve just outreach meaning just getting more people in here. So it's more about getting people in the door. Kind of like, hey, just buy our product versus becoming a disciple. And so that's why a lot of people call the other parts of the Great Commission the Great Omission, which is where Jesus says, teaching them to do everything I've commanded. That's what the heart is, actually teaching people to be like Jesus, to live the way of Christ. That's what church is supposed to be about. But it's a slight nuance if you think about it. When we make the emphasis on making disciples, I think the focus is just more on bringing people in the door. When it should be about what does that even mean? What does it look like? We should display a way of life, the way of Christ. And going back to my point, I would say in this day and age particularly, and I would say it's not only so, but maybe even more so than throughout history, the practice of contentment is, again, I think one of the most significant and powerful ways to be a disciple. Okay? So that's what I want to talk about today, contentment. I'm going to share a few passages, but here's the kind of main one I'm going to start with. And you may know this is from Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. And I'll go ahead and read it. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Okay, so I just realized I read a different translation, but it's okay. Same message, obviously, slightly different wording. But godliness with contentment is great gain. And I love how, just as a start, before I get into it, godliness and contentment are paired together, right? I really want to emphasize how important this is. Because, again, I think in this mission of make disciples, it's like just get them into the door and have them sing. That's like what it's become about. Have them come on Sunday. We want numbers. We want people on Sunday. We want people to do, and we want more people to come on Sunday. And all of our work is going to be about getting people to come on Sunday and doing stuff on Sunday. When Jesus is saying, teach people to live like the way I've shown you. Okay, that's the point. And man, just as a reminder of how much care, how much patience, intentionality that takes, Jesus only had 12 of such, right? That he really focused on. There were periods where there were many, but many of them left, as you may know, right? But I want to point out how godliness and contentment are coupled, because I think with this idea of making disciples, even this understanding of worship is a little limited, I think. And so I had a conversation with a friend just not too long ago, and he was saying, it's really hard for me to worship because on Sundays, and he was talking about his relationship with his pastor. And there's just some stuff going on there. He said, it's hard for me to worship God. Because on Sundays, like just, the message just doesn't hit. And a thought I was having was, it's interesting that worship to us is like singing and hearing a word, right? When I think contentment, as an example, is could be and ought to be such a powerful form of worship, right? And again, I love how it's godliness with contentment is great gain. And in this passage in Timothy, it seems particularly the contentment that Paul is talking about has a lot to do with contentment materially, right? And that's super relevant to all of us. Is that not? And I would argue that it is. It's not about your personality. It's about just the world we live in, the society, the culture we live in. And last thing to kind of just talk about why I wanted to talk about this and kind of the introductory stuff. It's been relevant in conversations I have with people. It's been relevant in my life, where I've shared this season, this past 6 months, year, 2 years, longer than that, maybe 10 years. By the way, you guys know I've been at OKC for 10 years? That's crazy, right? I deserve an award. So you guys should think about that. It's been so full, so much learning, so much growth. But if I'm honest with you guys, also a lot of battles with contentment. Feeling discontent, feeling like, am I doing enough? Feeling like, have I achieved enough? I don't have enough. These thoughts have always been there. I think what's been particularly challenging in this newer season, where I've entered into a second career, and I think there was this expectation, okay, now it's going to be so different and so much better, and being in this still like learning, building, and I think that was kind of, it was so good in the growth aspect. Also that feeling of like, man, like, is this what I signed up for? And I had this profound thought just a few days ago where I was kind of reflecting on, just my time at church and how it's been, just our experiences, especially like in the past year and just the 10 years and just the different things we've been through together, my growth in my family as a husband, as a dad, my growth and everything I'm experiencing vocationally, like at work as an MFT, and just these experiences I'm having and the conversations I get to have and the space I get to hold for people. And I was like, you know what? Like, my life is so amazing. If only I could get over this thought of like, but I don't make enough. Like a couple thoughts. If only I could get over that, and maybe like the thought of like, or this feeling of comparing. Or I look at some of my peers and I'm like, oh, but man, they're going to get licensed faster, or they're going to be further ahead in their careers, or they are further ahead in their careers. If only those two thoughts were gone, like my life would be amazing. And I think that's part of why I just feel like, man, like, I wonder if this is relevant to other people too. So that's kind of why I wanted to speak on contentment. And so first I want to talk about what contentment is not. Because I think contentment can be, especially in the spiritual context, it can be taught in such a way that can be very unhelpful. Okay? So if you look at the next slide, I just wrote a few bullets on what contentment is not, what it isn't. Okay? Yeah, if you go to the next slide, please. Okay. So just a few things. And again, we could talk about contentment, and I want to talk about it. I hope this is an ongoing conversation, because I think it should be like a core element of our faith, of our practice of faith, is wrestling with this, growing in this. So this is not exhaustive or comprehensive. None of my messages are this message. There's so much more, but this is hopefully just starting or continuing the conversation. What it's not invalidating pain. And we do that all the time as Christians. Hey, be content. You should be thankful, you should be content. So it's like, just, grow up, be stronger. People have it harder than you. And we do that a lot. A lot of us have maybe had to do that because we thought it was the best way to survive or cope through hardship and pain. But we see in Scripture, we see in Jesus' life, we see in God and how He treats pain, that He does not invalidate pain. I don't think that's what contentment has to mean. It doesn't mean repressing grief and sadness. It's kind of the same. These are kind of all the same, in the same vein, right? Contentment doesn't mean like you hold in or ignore sadness. And a lot of us do that. A lot of us, I believe, have grief, sadness, that we've never had a place to let out. Over things maybe that happened in our childhood. Maybe things that happened, I don't know, who knows when. And maybe church had a lot to do with it. Maybe you heard a message where the pastor said, but you need to be content. You need to be thankful still. And so you kind of said, okay, I guess it feels heavy anyway, so I guess I just got to put it down. Right? God created us so that that's actually not healthy. God created us so that when we do that, it comes out and leaks out in ways that are unhelpful to us and to other people in our relationships. It's not what that means. To be content doesn't mean you have to repress emotions. It doesn't mean you have to stuff your grief and sadness. Actually, God may be inviting you to release it. To open that up gently at a pace that makes sense for you. He may be inviting you to seek healing from Him in that regard. And again, connected to that is being super rational. I think that's what contentment or these teachings of being thankful or content can lead us to. Is like, how do I do it? And we feel like the only way is to be like, okay, I need to just disconnect from what I'm feeling, disconnect from the pain I have, and I'm just going to be very rational. And compared to the people in like Africa, I should be thankful, so I'm going to be thankful. And that's true, but I think contentment is this spiritual, inner, true, transformative work. And I don't think just being rational and again, suppressing emotions or just trying to disconnect with them is the way to go about it. Because again, God didn't create us to be like them. And when we are overly rational, it hurts our relationships and it hurts us. And so a lot of us do that. I do that with someone in this room. Where I'll be like, but why are you worried? Why are you anxious? Paul, and I can be very, because when it's not my stuff, it's easy to be overly rational. Doesn't have to mean that. I think God can hold both. He can hold all that pain while also allowing us and empowering us to experience contentment. Okay? So again, all these can be its own message, own conversation, own ongoing conversation, and I want those to be. These are just maybe more for you to think about and kind of, okay, hopefully it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And I have felt like that's what I was being told to do. Or I do that. That's something to think about. So just kind of hold that. Okay? So then what is contentment possibly if it's not these things? A few examples. You go to the next slide. I think there's an aspect of simplicity that's there. And you guys might not know this, but the practice of simplicity is traditionally a Christian spiritual practice, like a spiritual discipline. So you guys might not know that word, but or that phrase. When we think of spiritual disciplines, typically people think of prayer, fasting, maybe singing songs, meditation. But actually, again, a traditional spiritual discipline was the practice of simplicity. You know, like living simply. The extreme form of that would be like Christian monks, like historically. So I don't think there's many Protestant monks or evangelical monks, but in the early church, becoming a monk or like a nun, living in a parish or a monastery was an option that many Christians took, right? Looking back at this passage right here, it says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." Man, I think that's a hard one. I already feel like a lot of us, maybe it's like there's this resistance, you know, and I think there's been a lot of negative messages about this. Maybe I should have added, contentment doesn't have to mean like excessive or unnecessary, like self-martyrdom or like self-denial. It's not having to go out of your way to force self-denial. I want to really say that. Because a lot of us maybe have been taught that. You know, like, you know, in Korean Christian tradition or culture, it's actually shameful in some contexts for like Christians to be kind of wealthy to a certain degree, especially like pastors, right? It's weird. There's all this stigma and ideas about that. And so I think there's maybe this unhealthy or unnecessary self-denial. That's a version of that. But I think the extreme end is we live in a culture where everything's about just having more. And I would argue feeling like we need too much. Here's a quote that maybe is helpful. Go to the next slide. This is from a guy, Peter Walsh, from a book, It's All Too Much, An Easy Plan for Living a Richer Life with Less Stuff. This was a bestseller back in the day in 2007 it was published. We live in one of the most prosperous nations on earth, and we measure our success by material accumulation. But for many, it has become clear that instead of bringing us happiness and peace of mind, all this stuff is stressing us out and alienating us from our families, our partners, and our dreams. Is that relevant to anybody here? Not just me? Man, the stress of having to reach, you know, this financial goal, the toll it takes on me, my family, my happiness. And I mean this, I remember just this past having that thought, man, if only I just was okay with where we live and how much money we make, I would actually be really happy. That just hit me like a ton of bricks. I wonder how many other people in this world would feel that way or could feel that way, could unlock this joy if they could learn to maybe let go of some of these expectations or learn to kind of distance themselves from some of these sort of materialistic ideas. There is this historian, his name escapes me, but he has this idea of the empty self. And he has this idea that after World War II, America became super industrialized. And the American society just changed. Where before World War II, people, while America is individualistic, people were way more into helping each other, into like the social and common good. It was so much more natural for people just to be more thoughtful of one another. But post World War II, and he said it was two things. It was all these new advertisements and this new super like hyper industrial movement where everything was about buying stuff and just consumerism and like capitalism, right? And just fueling that, plus the trauma of the Great Depression, just created people to become super way more materialistic. That just became the norm. And I think I've shared this before, how in North Korea, they would show propaganda to North Koreans about Americans. And the message of the propaganda is that Americans are fed propaganda and are brainwashed to become enslaved by like material needs. And it was fascinating because it's like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, that's kind of true. And so we talk about how North Koreans receive propaganda. Their thing was like, dude, look at how Americans are. Look at how Westerners are. They are brainwashed to just need to have more, never be happy, never be content, need to buy more, have more. It was very fascinating. I think there's an aspect of contentment that is just practicing simplicity. And I know that's really hard. Secondly, what else is contentment? Go to the next slide, Yejin. I think contentment looks like hopeful acceptance. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, a very famous passage. Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, this is Paul talking, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. No one knows what that is. Some people say it was a physical sickness. Who knows? People have all kinds of theories. Paul received this crippling thing. Whether it was literally crippling or figuratively, we don't know. And it says he prayed 3 times, he's pleading to God, take it away, take it away, take it away. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I think a huge part of contentment is acceptance. Learning how to accept limitations. Whether it's personally, just our limitations, because every human being is limited. That is the nature and part of the definition of being human and not being God, is that we are limited. Whereas God is unlimited, we are not. I wonder what it would have been like for us to have received that message growing up. If we were told, hey, slow down. It's okay. You are limited. In a world where there is stability and surplus, it is encouraged to accept your limitations. Okay, I want you guys to hear that again. In a world where there is stability and surplus, we are encouraged to accept and to acknowledge our limitations. In a world where there is, what's the opposite of surplus? Deficit, yeah. Deficit and instability, we feel like to survive, we need to go beyond our limits. Okay? Everyone's Korean here, right? Our parents came from a world of instability and deficit. Post-war. If you know, for many of us, when our parents, not all of us, many of us, when our parents immigrated, Korea was literally, I don't know the exact ranking, one of the poorest nations in the world, right? Nina's dad talks about like living in a place where they didn't have plumbing, and like their sewage was just like this drain in front of their home. Extreme poverty. And so it makes sense that for a lot of us, we feel like we need to go beyond our limits. And it's hard to accept when we feel limited. And for whatever way, or whatever area of our life is limited. It's really hard for us. But even for Paul, I see that. He's like, remove this. And God's like, it's okay. I'm going to show you that even with this, it's okay. My grace is sufficient. And I think there's this hopefulness to that acceptance. Well, I believe, to me, what this is saying is, what God is saying is, I want you to see that even in these circumstances that make you feel limited for whatever reason, I can work in them to maybe help you become a better person, right? It says to help him from becoming conceited. Maybe I'm helping you to grow. I can work maybe through them. We see God works through our circumstances where it's like, oh, I thought this was going to be bad, but actually this is what he did, right? And despite them. I think that's a key word. I think here that's some of that is he's saying, yeah, this is a hindrance to you, but even despite that, Paul, I will be enough. If you trust me, you will see that I am enough, even despite your circumstances. I wonder how Paul's prayers might have changed from pleading with God to take it away to who knows what his prayers look like afterwards. Delighting, thanking God, maybe saying, God, despite these weaknesses, would you remind me, would you teach me, would you help me to experience that your grace is sufficient? So I think, it's this hopeful acceptance. And again, we could talk so much about that, but just going to kind of leave that for you to think about. And lastly, it's kind of similar, but this idea of rejoicing. If you go to the next slide, please. In Philippians 4, Philippians is a famous book for the word, because the word joy or rejoice shows up so many times. In chapter 4, verse 4, the last chapter, Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Later he says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need. He's talking about just some of his hardships. So I'm not sharing all my hardships because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Famous passage, right? We talk about, it's kind of funny, a lot of times I feel like this passage is spoken or tattooed or put on the wall in a spirit, not of contentment, but more of like ambition. It's like, I'm going to get more, I'm going to accomplish huge things, and I can do it all in Christ. And I'm all for that, but it's a reminder, a good reminder might be the context of this is actually, what he means by I can do all this is, I can be content in any situation through Christ. And I love this language. I've learned the secret of being content. It's like that word, secret, it's also can be translated mystery. And when I think we don't get the full impact of maybe what it meant. When we just say secret, it's like, oh, there's my secret's a skill. Mystery, that word had a very spiritual connotation. It was like this very spiritually loaded idea. It's this spiritual gift, so to say, of being content in every situation. Going back to my point earlier, if following Christ, what does that mean? It means living by the Spirit, living empowered by the Spirit. That means so many things. So what does it mean to live empowered by the Spirit? You might think, it means like when I'm able to kind of be like, I feel like, to say these really prophetic words. And that's true. We may think a lot of things. What if living empowered by the Spirit meant being able to be content in all kinds of circumstances? I think that's what Paul is saying here. One way I kind of framed it was having spiritual eyes or vision. To be able to see in all kinds of circumstances what God might be doing. Going back to what I said earlier. Or what he might be wanting to do even despite my circumstances. To be able to see circumstances Not in the way that maybe the world or just people might see it, but in a way that actually produces joy. Again, with the caveat, I'm not saying this to invalidate what you're going through or just minimize hardship. That's not my point. Okay? And just lastly, I just want to name and kind of normalize why it's also very hard to be content. Because this might all sound nice, but we should acknowledge that it's very hard. There's a few reasons I'll talk about. One is culture and society. I talked about the pressures of our society. It's a very materialistic culture that we live in, right? I totally get that. It's hard to navigate through that. You know, like, people, I have conversations with people all the time, and I remember people would always tell me this, like, you know, there's this language that's used a lot, especially like, you know, people would be like, you know, like, compared to the rest of the world, you're like a millionaire. It's true, like, you know, how much money I have, if I, like, the cash value, if I go to like many other nations or places, I will be like the richest person there. I remember going to Vietnam with our mission team, our short trip, and I remember the currency. Who remembers the currency in Vietnam? The dong, right? Very easy to remember because it sounds silly to Americans, I think. I remember, I think Carol was the money holder, as always. And I think at one point she had like $1 million dong, right? Yeah, she had millions of dong. Dongs? Dong? I don't know how to. And I remember in my head I was like, man, I think I said this as a joke. I don't even remember. I think I said this. It could have been a joke I said in my head. I was like, man, this is the one place where I can be a millionaire, right? It's true. So it's weird though, because you hold that, but then at the same time, I don't feel rich. I don't know how many of you feel that rich or rich. I think most of us, what we're trying to achieve is like, what we were taught is like middle class. You know, we're not trying to like, many people I meet are not trying to, like, they're not like, I just want to be filthy rich. That's my goal. I don't meet many Christians who say that. At the same time, man, to get to that middle class, at least, and I think many of us can relate to this, oh my goodness, how hard it is. How much work. You know, and it's weird because it's like both parents have to work, but then if both parents have to work, then we have to put our kid at daycare, but then daycare is expensive, so they have to work more. It's like, it's just hard. I want to name that. I don't want to say, I don't ever want to be like, you know, guys, like, we should be fine with making like, you know, $10,000 or something. You know, it's like, there's just these realities of living in California. And so I want to name that. It's extremely complicated and difficult. I don't know if I have a solution. I don't know if I can break down a number like, this number is where you should be content. But what I'm hoping is to name it, and to also for us to be aware, like, yeah, to have that spiritual conversation with each other and with God. Yeah, God, what does contentment look like? What could acceptance, what could simplicity look like as a Orange County person? Okay? Probably doesn't mean like living like in a cabin. All right, I get that, but what could it look like? You know, and maybe that's where we get stuck, is we're like, you can't live simply if you live in California. There's no way, you know, we're gonna live off of X amount of salary. How am I gonna raise a family like that? And we just say, so I can't, we just ignore this huge aspect of our faith. When I'm trying to say, no, let's contextualize it. What does it look like as Southern Californians, as Orange County people or LA people, to be content, to live in simplicity? It doesn't have to mean you don't have a car. It doesn't have to mean you get around by bicycle, okay? But what could it mean? Could it mean like maybe instead of this car, I buy this car? Maybe. I'm not saying that I don't want to shame anybody. I'm not trying to say, oh, hey, why do you have I won't even say the car, okay? Why do you have a Hyundai, Daniel, instead of a Kia? Everyone knows that Hyundai is a more expensive Korean car brand. Okay, yeah, you're right. I could have got actually, I don't even know if it's more expensive. But you get my point. I'm not trying to do that. I don't want to create a culture where it's like, oh, why do they have that car? It could look different for every person. But is this a conversation? Is this something we talk about with God, with each other? Like, what does that look like, contentment? What does simplicity look like? It's hard I get it, it's hard. But that's why maybe I'm trying to open up, like, can we talk about it like safely, creatively, right? Without judgment, because it's hard. I want to put it out there, it's hard, okay? Comparison, that's a big one. I'll just kind of leave it at that. Man, we compare, right? And lastly, it's just, I think a lot of us never receive permission to be content. Because we were taught to strive for more. Contentment it can feel weird because maybe for some of us, contentment, at the end of the day, it feels like, man, it's equated with laziness. Maybe what contentment looks like for us, and there's another voice in our head that's lazy. Or that's not trying hard enough. Or that's not taking advantage of this blessing you received. Right? It's being ungrateful. That makes it hard, those messages. But what about the call to contentment? What about the invitation from God, who not only gives us permission, but says this is a gift. Contentment is a gift. It's the secret to unlocking joy. For a lot of us, it's hard to give ourselves permission to practice contentment because our identity is wrapped up in our achievements and our assets. Right? How much I have, how much I've achieved is directly tied to my value. It could be like how lovable I am, how wanted I am, how good I am. Man, that must be so hard then to be content, to practice contentment. Because maybe doing so makes you feel like I'm a failure. I'm just not enough. Or even I'm doing something wrong, right? And so I'm naming this to say, my point being, I want to be able to have these open conversations where I'm not trying to say, why aren't you content? Why are you so sinful? So I know it's hard. It is really hard for so many different reasons. And so I just wrote down 3 sort of short prayers that maybe we could pray together along those lines, acknowledging that it's hard, acknowledging that contentment is a mystery, it's a secret, it's a spiritual working of Christ within us. It doesn't mean we can't take steps, we can't pursue it, but it is a spiritual work. And I think a first step is to just acknowledge, like, God, I need help with this. If you want it, if you feel the value, if you feel the conviction, then to say, God, I want to know what that's like to be able to be content. What if that was our prayer instead of just, oh God, I know you're mad at me because I'm not content. God, I hear you. I know you're judging me because I'm materialistic. No, what if God's saying, hey, I want this for you. Let's talk about it. Let's talk. Yejin, if you could put up that last slide. Here are the prayers. In the power and safety of your loving grace, help me to accept my limitations and to know that in my weakness, you are strong and your grace is sufficient. Help me to separate my worth and identity from my accomplishments and assets. Help me to know that I am enough simply because I am your child. Help me to see with spiritual eyes your love and care for me and the world, your love and care for me and the world, in, through, and despite my circumstances. So I invite you guys, take a minute and just kind of pray. You can pray those prayers. You can pray along those lines. And then I'll say a prayer to close our service, okay? But take a minute, and if these are meaningful at all, if any of these are, if anything I shared is stirring up a prayer in your heart, in the safety of God's grace, I invite you to share that prayer with Him, and then I'll close, okay, after that. God, thank you for the hope of contentment. I pray that you would work in all of us, refine us, heal us, and build up contentment within us. Not forced contentment out of guilt or shame. God, not a pressure within us to feel bad when we buy things or want things. But Lord, that you would put within us truly the gift, the power, the ability to be thankful, to rejoice, to be content in all kinds of circumstances. To be able to be a people who are accepting of our limitations. To be able to be a people who are not needing to strive and to burn ourselves out every day, but to learn to have peace wherever we are. Lord, would you fill us with joy through contentment? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, guys, that concludes our service. If you could help to set up the tables the way that they're arranged in the diagram that I sent in the chat group, okay? So it's quite straightforward, yeah. And then let's get lunch, and we can eat at the cafe. And if you haven't seen it, it's quite nice. So let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, it's like, let me look at it real quick.